Pause. This is being recorded, and we will post the recording of today's webinar on our website for future reference. And I want to start by offering a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I'd also like to mention two upcoming events. We have tomorrow, Thursday, the 21st, an event that we are co-sponsoring with, and it will be in person. It's the Navajo Nation Water Settlements presentation, and information about that, I believe Jesse's posting in the chat and is available on our website for more details and to register for that. The next event is an announcement about our annual conference. It will be held in May 20th and 21st this year. The theme is Shared Borders, Shared Waters, Working Together in Times of Scarcity. And more information is available on our website. We are also excited to announce that we are hiring a GIS postdoctoral research scholar who will be helping us with a variety of tasks and data analysis and updating an Arizona water map. We are hoping to have that position hired in January. So if you're interested, please submit your applications as soon as you're able. And please share this announcement with anyone you think might be interested. Okay, so just two more slides of introduction and then we'll turn it over to our speakers, but this is related to today's topic. So one of the key roles that the Water Resources Research Center serves is to administer the what's called the 104 program. And this is through the Water Resources Research Act with the U.S. Geological Service. And so every year there is an opportunity through the 104 program for two types of grants. The first grant is the 104B, which is what we call small research grants. And these are for water research on water-related issues involving students. People at any of Arizona's 3 state universities are eligible to apply. This coming year, we expect to award 2 to 4 grants of up to $10,000. We do encourage applications for less than $10,000 as well. The process is a little tricky. USGS has to release their RFP or request for proposals, which is not yet out. Their deadline is usually quite quick, comes up quite quickly, and we at the WRRC have to evaluate the proposals that come in. So we are already advertising for 2025, even though the USGS RFP has not yet been released. Sometime probably in April. So we would like our internal, we're requesting applications to be sent to us by 5 p.m. on Monday, March 3rd, so that we can be sure to get those sent on to the USGS. And there's more information on our website. Just briefly, because there is another portion of the 104 program, this is the 104G. This is a very different program. This is a nationally competitive grant program. So we at the WRRC do not review these. However, we do have to submit them. So if you are planning on submitting a 104G, please keep in mind that our internal deadline at the WRRC is earlier than the USGS deadline because we have to compile this and submit all of the applications at the same time. So we have set the deadline. We anticipate the RFP being released again, probably sometime in March. And so we would like the 104G applications submitted to us at this time. We're saying Friday, May 2nd. And there's more information on that program on our website. Okay, so Next, I would like to introduce our speakers today. We'll have 3 speakers talking about 2 different projects that were funded last year. We'll have Min-Venditti, whose work is situated at the nexus of political ecology, critical geography, and environmental human sciences. During their PhD studies, they have come to study Indigenous knowledges, power, values, and trauma, and how they relate to water narratives and relations with water in a changing climate. Min-Venditti employs an action research framework and has collaborated with communities in resistance across continents. As a doctoral student at Arizona State University, they have crossed disciplinary thresholds to immerse themselves in social work, transborder studies, and human communications. Min-Venditti has worked on 2 collective embodiment projects, as well as an art and sustainability water conservation social media campaign. Presenting with Ame will be Angelina Mann, who is an undergraduate student at Arizona State University, double majoring in English, creative writing, and Spanish literature and culture with a minor in American Indian Studies. So they'll present first, but I'll go ahead and introduce Vanessa Buzzard. Dr. Buzzard is a research scientist in the University of Arizona School of Natural Resources and the Environment. Dr. Buzzard's research has focused on understanding drivers of biodiversity and ecosystem function in response to climate and anthropogenic disturbances in natural and built environments. Her research aims to quantify shifts in physical, chemical, and biological soil health indicators in response to green stormwater infrastructure practices to understand restoration of ecosystem functions and co-benefits generated by stormwater capture and reuse. She is also the founder of the University of Arizona Campus Living Lab in Green Stormwater Infrastructure, which I need to check out. That sounds great. An initiative to bridge understanding across disciplines, studying the performance of green stormwater infrastructure in Tucson. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to Ame and Angelina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Good morning, or I guess good afternoon now, everyone. We're here, I'm going to wait for the slides, but to talk about our research project, which we call Writing Indigenous Water Stories. And you can move to the next slide, just to share why we decided to do this research and how it came about. So in spring of 2023, when we applied for the grant, there was a class that was a mixed undergrad and graduate class at Arizona State University in the American Indian Studies Department with Dr. Myla Vicente Carpio, who's now at the University of New Mexico. And that class was called Indigenous Water Knowledge, Sovereignty, Culture, and Rights. And from there, the class as a whole decided to apply for this grant in order to expand on the knowledges that we were learning about, specifically focused on story. So this project ended up aiming to share water stories related to the experience of Native American communities in Arizona with a wider audience. As we heard in the land acknowledgement, although there are 22 tribal nations in this state alone, most people don't necessarily know about the depth of cultural and spiritual connections to water. Usually water is considered more of a commodity or a resource or something that's quantifiable. Furthermore, nationally, Indigenous communities have some of the highest rates of water insecurity. So this project brought together highlighting that need and those stories, as well as being able to connect these to the public's concern about water access and health and the broader need to learn about water culture. And so the idea, doing research more on narratives and more on this sort of expressive communication, is a way of acknowledging different types of knowledge and inspiring new ideas and solutions by including and centering Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing in the sciences. All right, so the next one. So to achieve sort of this great hope of informing Arizona water management with Indigenous perspectives, this project trained students and community members to research and write opinion pieces for local and tribal news outlets. So we did that through a university class that was run here in the American Indian Studies Department, where students and community members gathered weekly for help with research development and writing. And furthermore, this research grant funded participation in a formalized specific training through the OpEd Project called Write to Change the World, that works on specifically helping marginalized writers or writers with marginalized identities to find their voice and understand what makes a successful op-ed and help in that publishing process. So through this process, the students and community members in our group gained valuable skills in research, writing, and publishing. So we're hoping to highlight a little bit of that as we go. Next slide. Tell you first a little bit more about how we did our research and kind of the methods for this project. So first, the class, our goals were to, again, develop voice and empower people to share their own stories through socio-emotional development and building trust and centering relational values. Another goal was to go through the whole writing and pre-publishing process, which means brainstorming, which means practice writing, which means understanding the publishing process, and so on. And finally, we really were encouraging people to understand that it's not just data, it's not just story, these things can be supplementary. And so as you'll hear from Angelina as we go forward, there's some examples of how that's done really creatively. Next. All right, so for the class, we, as I just said, we're trying to integrate or at least highlight the difference between and the synthesis between Indigenous and Western scientific water knowledges by focusing on storytelling as method and specifically opinion writing. And again, understanding what it takes to cultivate practice of writing. Next. So some of the specific ways that we did get at these goals and through that structure were having Indigenous guest journalists come and talk to our class about their careers and about their processes, a field trip to the Gila River Cultural Center where there was a water exhibit and conversation with knowledge holders there, collaboration with the Water Sim Project funded in part through, I think, the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative that's working on stories as well in virtual and augmented reality. And then we also integrated pedagogical methods such as doing free writes and kind of more, I guess, community-oriented feedback as opposed to written peer review. We did use a modified critical response process as an activity where we sat in a circle and were able to both share our work and also elicit the specific feedback we wanted as part of that writing process. So happy to share more in the questions, but with that, let's move forward and I'll turn it over to Angelina to tell you a little bit about what the OpEd Project training was like.
Hello, my name is Angelina. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I got to participate in the Indigenous Water Stories op-ed writing class. And then over the summer, I was able to participate in one of the OpEd Project workshops. It's a 2-day process in which accomplished op-ed writers from marginalized communities give training to interested parties on how to brainstorm, write, and get published with op-eds. As you'll see when I do a reading of it, the op-ed that I focused on was I wrote a poem as an op-ed. I am very interested both in combining Indigenous and Western knowledges, as well as in combining different forms of writing in a complementary way. So the op-ed project was, as someone who's a creative writer rather than so much as a persuasive writer, it was very educational. It was definitely a worthwhile experience that I'm so grateful to the grant funding for permitting me to participate in. And then as part of the post-work of the workshop, we are given the opportunity to send in our op-ed to be matched with a mentor who will provide us with feedback. The only hitch in the project was when I went to submit my op-ed for consideration for mentorship. And I got a response saying that my project was not an op-ed, it was a poem, which was just a little road bump that I found a little odd, given the desire to uplift different voices. But I was able to send them an explanation, seeing as I had written my op-ed using their guidelines, and they agreed to assign me a mentor. So they are very flexible. Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and I'm looking to start submitting my op-ed for publication soon.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to share an excerpt or a couple of excerpts from other students' op-eds as well, and interspersed with Angelina sharing yours. I will start, all right, with one by Cole Hussey, and I'll read a couple paragraphs of that briefly. So, just as Indigenous resistance has been constant, so has the Salt River struggled to survive under a century and a half of mismanagement and overexploitation. From the interruption of the Salt River flow to city leadership allowing Motorola to pull out connective groundwater in the 1980s and 1990s, the city and state have not been kind stewards to the riverlands. This is the result of a resource-oriented mindset in which the river exists to be translated into profit, without any mind for the life it sustains. But as history shows, it is also the product of an actively malevolent system that worked to steal land and labor by disrupting the river. It is not a neutral choice to continue to use the system as intended without substantial reform or revision. So how do we reform or revise how the city of Phoenix manages the Salt River? There's no singular correct way, but a spectrum of possible solutions. All of these solutions must involve direct collaboration with Indigenous nations, particularly the Salt River Pima Maricopa and the Gila River Pima Maricopa tribes. Co-managing water, where the tribes are involved in river-related decision-making, is a possible and likely productive approach. Allowing small streams of the river to return along permanent riparian corridors, creating designated areas of habitat and river rehabilitation is another. The combination of both could be incredibly effective at moving the city towards a better relationship with water, the Salt River, and tribes who deserve better than what they're getting. It will not somehow absolve the city or be the end of the discussion, but it will open pathways to brighter futures and healthier relationships with water. All right. Would you like to share yours?
Yes, and would I be able to share my screen real quick? Because there's a slight visual element to the poem. All right. Again, there we go. All right. So I wrote this poem as the op-ed, and I'm gonna go ahead and read it and then explain a couple of the ideas behind it. It is water. When the well runs dry, billions cannot access it. When the sky bleaches white and the turn of a faucet drags forth only a gritty sludge of thick, dead air, because that is all the seared and searing pipes know. It contains arsenic, manganese, iron, in levels unsafe for human consumption. We will burrow our feet deep down into the crumbling, crunching earth. A drastic step to protect it. Tribe to stop contributing to state reservoir. We cannot continue to put the interests of all others above our own. We will swell up like the saguaro when we catch the mere scent of that which animates our bodies. I am it. It is me. You, though, will you sprout spines, isolate, refuse to take the outstretched hand, refuse to permit your own to wander too far from your personal hell of desiccation? The US doesn't recognize it as included in the right to life. You will bake in the inescapable sun that seeks you out no matter where you hide, behind curtains, under the solid wood of the kitchen table, in the dust of the hall closet, under the covers, atop the dresser. Not even when you become the monsters under your own beds will you be able to fight off the long, inexorable siphoning of the source of all beings sucked from your shrinking, shriveling bodies. Never again, we vow. It is life. Mani Wikoni. This is all we have left. It and the lands you didn't take last time. What will you do when all of it is gone, fled away from your grasping hands to a world where its honor will not rust and decay? For millions of years, the Colorado carved its way 1,450 miles from the Rockies to cross the coastline, but now no longer reaches the shattered shore. What will we do? It is our first medicine. What can we do? We are born in it. What are you doing? You stand between it and us. What have you done? So that is my poem, Op-Ed. The idea for it came while we were doing a free write, and a lot of the time my thoughts come out in poetry during free writes, and I started writing this. I cultivated it as a combination of data and quotes from news articles. As you'll see, I have links there and I have a bibliography. A combination between the emotional aspect of Indigenous peoples watching the water be taken away, and then various number statistics, quotes from Indigenous peoples and news articles. And that's why I have them alternating on sides, to show that contrast and to represent kind of the conversation between the real experience of Native peoples in relation to water, both culturally, spiritually, and practically, with the expression of that in a public manner. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very powerful. I'm going to share one more excerpt. Yeah, I'm still sitting with your words. And this is from Michael Littlecrow. As I look back on my life, the water's lessons about how to be an Anishinaabe man were always there, taught to me through my mother and grandmother and brought to life through the way my grandfather, Henry LaFontaine, lived his life. I did not always listen to or apply those lessons. In fact, I see many actions I wish I could go back and change, many ways of seeing things that were not in line with the curriculum that water provided. Yet, the past is done and cannot be unlived or changed. The awareness of those mistakes is the way that water gives us a second chance, an opportunity to listen and apply the lesson of peace, love, and compassion for ourselves and others. Just before my grandma passed, she was heard speaking in Cree, the language that only she and my grandfather knew, the language they had been forbidden to speak at boarding school. My mother, as she was passing, whispered, "Just let go." I was not there, but I take these stories to mean that Grandpa Hank had come to welcome his first daughter and his wife home to the other side. I just hope that when he comes for me, I will have lived a life of service to our people, respect for all life, and shown the same unconditional love to my wife and family as he had. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. It's just a thank you slide. That's what we wanted to share. Happy to take some questions now.
And I'd also like to say thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you, Ame. Thank you, Angelina. This was a great presentation. And yeah, I remember learning about 10 years ago that indeed op-eds are predominantly written by men. And so I love that this project has really opened up op-ed writing to a variety of voices, and that's such an important step. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I'll see if anyone else has any questions. Otherwise, I have a question. But let's see first if anyone out there. Feel free to unmute yourself or pop your question into the chat. Well, I will start. I know in the intro you mentioned that the op-eds, you'd be looking to place those op-eds in, I think you said state newspapers as well as tribal newspapers. I'm curious if there's more of a focus on one type of paper, and if you've had any go through the process, and like, are you getting a different reception from different types of paper? I'm sorry to hear the poem. I think you said you were told that didn't fit maybe the form for the op-ed, but I'm wondering if different newspapers might have a different reception to some of these different forms, and maybe a bit different from what we typically see as an op-ed, which is the point, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Actually, Angelina, have you submitted yours yet?
I haven't submitted it yet. I'm going to go through some final rounds of polishing, but in my research for seeking publication, there are a couple of kind of niche papers and publications that have specific areas for op-ed poetry, which I didn't know was a thing prior to this research. And I also, in looking at national mainstream newspapers like the Washington Post, they have a piece on writing op-eds, and it addresses that poems are not often op-eds, but that they can be, which is part of what gave me the motivation to write back to the OpEd Project and say, even the Washington Post says that a poem could be an op-ed, so why not take a chance on it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we did have a discussion as a class, and I haven't followed up with everyone yet to see if anyone else has taken action on publishing, but a lot of the publications that were mentioned were either community publications within people's indigenous communities that they come from. Indian Country Today, I think, got named. There were some that, like, for example, the piece about the Salt River, there was more of an interest in sharing with Phoenix, regional or local outlets. And yeah, I guess there's also, I'm trying to find the name of the publication issue, but there is a publication at ASU called Red Ink that focuses on Indigenous literature and arts and other sorts of, prose as well. So we're trying to encourage students to continue on those processes, but at this moment, Angelina is a good example. They're still in process. I think I also got a question in the chat about what actionable results come from your writing. Well, the hope is that this is something that can start to influence how people think about water and broaden sort of the set of assumptions that people have about culture and water here in Arizona. And as you heard in one of the op-eds, there's a specific ask in that piece to work with Indigenous communities on water management. So each op-ed had a different specific ask or argument, and some of them were about dam removal. Some of them were about Indigenous communities outside of Arizona, since our class was not restrained geographically. And then a lot of them were about water rights on Navajo Nation, for example.
And I think a lot of them were very much so about awareness, because something that we discussed as being significant during the class was that, there are still people who don't know that Native people are still here. And so bringing attention to the major harm that has been done to our access to water is very important that I think is embodied in, for example, the quote that the US does not include it as part of the right to life, it being water, which is, you know, a pretty wild thing, seen as all living things need water to live. So I think awareness for sure of no matter what area of the US, no matter what specific area of water rights, water studies, cultural connections that we wrote from, it was primarily about awareness.
Thank you.
Well, I want to pause for just a few more seconds to see if there is a final question here before we move on to our second presentation. Any final questions for Ame and Angelina? And I will note our webinars go from 12 to 1:15. However, Ame does have a previous commitment and will need to leave early. So this is your chance to ask a question for Ame. Okay, well, let's thank them for this great presentation on writing Indigenous water stories. And I would now like to turn it over to Vanessa Buzzard for your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll share my screen and let's get this bar out of the way. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
And hear me? Thank you all, and that was a really great talk. I'm really glad I got to learn more about the water talk. So this is a really great session, and I'm happy to be here. I'm actually presenting on behalf of Phoenix Spivey, who's a graduate student who just finished from the School of Natural Resources in the Environment with her master's. And so she had something come up today and was unable to present. So she shared some slides, and I'll go through some of the work that she did while she was here and supported by this project. So a quick outline, give some background information. We are going into rainwater harvesting, green infrastructure, soil health, some of these things that we want to make sure that everybody is familiar with and that we're defining in a common way. The research objectives that really kind of outlined her thesis work while she was here, some of the methods, the spatial and temporal drivers of soil health and soil health indicators with respect to our wonderful monsoon season that we have here, some basic conclusions and big picture. So how does this all fit together? And this is our beautiful campus, and this is one of the locations that was sampled near Gold Simpson. So we have a lot of anthropogenic and climate impacts that really lead to a shift in ecosystem function and services and really impact our soils. And so we can think about urbanization, habitat fragmentation, and this soil degradation. And so there's a lot of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions that are being put in place, especially here in the city of Tucson and Pima County, to help capture water and to shift our what can be a nuisance in the other parts of the world to a resource which is really critical here in the arid Southwest region. And so capturing that water and allowing it to infiltrate into the soils and to support vegetation in bioswales, green roofs, or green rain gardens. And we want to kind of think about how, well, let's talk first about what rain gardens are. So we'll focus on rainwater gardens. And so the EPA has defined these as depressed areas in the landscape that collects rainwater from rooftops, driveways, streets, and allows it to soak in the ground. And that's a really key part, is that we have so much hardscape in our urban areas that it's really important for us to make regions and create landscapes that promote infiltration and promote capture of water, allow it to slow, spread, and soak in. And so we know that there's impacts that are related to these features. Oftentimes we see them and they're dry because they're not functioning. They do function when it rains during those seasonal periods. So our winter rains and our summer rains. So seasonality is important. Other drivers of what may happen in these soils and in the vegetation is the type of water that's being used. So oftentimes we're using reclaimed water on our landscapes for the city of Tucson, but we could be using this rainwater, capturing in tanks, reapplying it, redirecting it from rooftops, but more common than not, we're using potable water sources. So relieving some of that tension that we have on providing green spaces and cooling effects that are co-benefits of these green spaces with our conservation of water. And so can we use different water types? But then the frequency and abundance of these watering events also plays a role. So if we have a high frequency, we may expect there to be greater impact on the soil and on the vegetation. If the abundance of that water at a given time just leads to quick flooding and runoff, then it may not have that same kind of benefit. But we know that green infrastructure has many benefits. There's lots of co-benefits that lead to clean air and water, flood protection, stormwater redirection, soil health enhancement, and cooling. And so soil health is a bit complex and it needs to be defined in a very clear way when we think about what does this mean, because it's a suite of variables that we can measure to say something about the soil, and there's a lot that goes into it, but really defining and understanding what this means is important for moving forward. So we use the NRCS USDA website definition for soil health, and it's defined as a continued capacity as a vital living ecosystem to sustain plants, animals, and humans. So really it's that baseline, it's vital, right? And it has so many functional benefits. So it regulates water, it's filtering and buffers pollutants, it cycles and stores nutrients, and it creates more stable environments. So it plays a big role in our urban system where it's often very degraded. But there's a lack of information and clarity on how to interpret and measure soil health indicators because there's just so many. So thinking about the large, and I'll list a few in the next couple of slides, the large suite of indicators that can be included when we want to understand a system, but really thinking about, are there ways and are there many that we need to measure, or can we narrow that down to just a couple? Because there are so many and they're not always accessible cost wise. There's limitations, interpretation, there's not a lot of clarity, or there's a lot of background information that's needed, or skills in bioinformatics that's and computational power for being able to analyze some of the omics style data that we could collect. So yeah, there's a lot going on. And we don't always know what to do and what it means. But we are trying to address some of these plot holes, as Phoenix would like to say. So these scientific gaps, by thinking about how these soil health indicators are impacted by management practices. So how are we changing and supporting specific soil health in systems? And In a recent study that we did here in Tucson, we were able to see that biological soil health indicators, oftentimes they're broken up into your physical, chemical, and biological health, were responding quicker to the management practices of installation of rain garden basins. And we've seen other work that shows that seasonal precipitation also influences the biology. So our monsoon season is very prevalent. We have a lot of rain that comes at once. And we do see increase in CO2 emissions, but we also see an increase in hydrogen uptake. So these greenhouse gases, these atmospheric gases. So that's a nice proxy for activity that's happening in the soils. Those microbes are awake during that time when there's water available. And so the goal of the research that Phoenix led was to look at these different relationships between soil health indicators, as well as some of the management practices across different landscapes. And she focused on a park and the university. There's a few sites at the University of Arizona that she used as her study system, and then a local resident. And she went through and did a lot of work. So there's a list of, I think, 20 soil health indicators here. She didn't look at every one that's listed by the NRCS USDA. But as you can see, this is a really extensive list, and there's a lot that can be done. And there's some cool stuff that there's, some overlap and there's some relationships between these two. But then there's also, just there's not always a clear path forward. So do you measure everything? With the funds that she received from the WRRC Student 104B, she was able to look at quite a few soil health indicators and think about how these impact carbon cycling. So really interested in carbon cycling. And then also introducing some new potential indicators. So extracellular polymeric substances, I like to think about them like gum or something in the soil. So they're a biofilm that's excreted by plants and soil microbes in response to environmental stressors. And so, during drought or high temperatures, plants kind of use them to create soil aggregates, and they support these kind of functions to retain more water and to acquire nutrients. And so this could be a nice, metric for combining some of these different soil health indicators into one single indicator to kind of get a cumulative sense of what's happening. So she wanted to look at that. And one of the things that was done in the project that I'll show some nice pictures of was that, we want to think about other easy ways of engaging the public as well. And the tea bag experiment is a really cool experiment that's worldwide, where you just go and you incubate tea bags. You have a green tea and a ribose tea that you bury into the soil, and by burying them and incubating them and leaving them in the soil for a certain amount of time, when you pull them out, you can say something and do some calculations for carbon stabilization and decomposition rates of those systems. And so it was a fun experiment to do with students from Sunnyside High School, and then also throughout these different sites. But we were able to include this work as part of this project as well, to get at these kind of carbon cycling metrics, and think about this as a new indicator that can be more accessible. Extracellular enzymes, while they're not new soil health indicators, they are on that list that's provided above, but they're oftentimes looked at in context of agricultural use. So we wanted to think about what other kinds of management practices can we think the importance of these enzyme activity. And, you know, because they're really important for nutrient cycling, for building soil organic matter, for helping create those aggregates in the soils that are important. And so using it in this context was something that Phoenix wanted to do and was new for this work. So the questions that she had were thinking about it at these different scales. So thinking about this regional precipitation in terms of the monsoon. So measuring pre and post monsoon to see if there's drivers of different processes and impacts on the soils when water does become available in these rainwater basins. The type of treatment, so thinking about if we can look at adjacent systems, so within a basin and outside of a basin, and then at the site level at these different locations. We hypothesize that variations in physical, biological, and chemical indicators will be impacted by these changes across sites, the regimes, seasonal regimes, and the treatments. And so here's an example of the site that we have at the residence. So here's the home. There's a gray water basin, an active water basin, some impervious surfaces, a control system that's an unaltered landscape, but still all relatively close, and then a passive water basin that just receives rain waterfall. So looking strictly at the control area and the passive for this study. So here's a nice example of what that looks like. So our non-basin control areas are an unaltered landscape, whereas the passive are these depressed basins that have some type of structural changes to the topography of the landscape that allow the direction of the water to flow into those basins to stay. She measured over 19 soil health indicators, and from the list that I shared above, there was roughly 20 that are commonly used, and we didn't get too far away from that large amount, but getting at these large suites will help us kind of narrow down. So measuring a lot, and she measured 60 samples. And so here's some nice pictures of the different sites. So again, this is that residential site. You can't see the control, it's out of this picture, but then the active water basin is over here, and then we have our passive water. A lot of these do differ in their age, so that was a factor that we didn't really think about too much when going through, but it can be a factor when moving forward that can lead to some of the differences. We have the atmospheric science building. There's an impervious bike path, and so the sites along this area here, there's some basins that are set up to capture that stormwater from the rooftops and hard surfaces. Old Main has a nice rain garden basin that's been, it's roughly 8 years old, and it's all coming from the rooftop downspouts. And then Gold Simpson. So there's these sites. This is the park, this green box here. This is Gunny Barris Park near Sunnyside High School in South Tucson. And this was installed, and these two here were only 1 month old. So she had these different indicators that she looked at, and there's 4 physical, 7 biological, 8 chemical indicators. So again, this is a large suite. Not all of them made it through to the next round, so did some great analyses to look at their relationships with one another that I won't go into any detail for this talk, but we're just going to dive into some of the relationships she saw with the suite. She also looked at texture to see how these sites related to one another, and they're all sandy loam. We know that throughout the city of Tucson, that's a pretty common soil type. And so she did find that these soils were all relatively similar to one another in texture, which is important when we're looking at these other metrics. This was the field sampling day at the different locations, but here's a nice, most of this is at Gunny Park with the high school students to get them out in the field and teach them a little bit about soil health, and then also the project that was being done by the City of Tucson Storm to Shade program in their field right behind the schoolyard. So give them a little bit more context of why that area was closed down for so long and what kind of beautifying was happening in that space. She did work in a AMDS environmental science group doing extra polymeric substances extractions and whoops, we're jumping around a lot, sorry. And also in School of Natural Resources, Rachel Gallery's lab, looking at the extracellular enzyme assays. So there was a lot of troubleshooting in doing those assays for both indicators. And I'm going to focus strictly on the biological and the chemical and not all of them. So just to keep time going. But one of the commonly used is soil organic matter. And soil organic matter in the arid Southwest desert system tends to be really low. And we're seeing that, it's really low. It's going to be really low in our urban system as well, where we're working with oftentimes degraded compacted soils that are devoid of life. But as we start to landscape these areas and to add water to them, we hope that there's going to be some changes. And we look at this figure here, and we have soil organic matter on the y-axis. We have our 5 different locations, and we have our passive and control treatments. So our passive are those water harvesting basins. The control is those flat surfaces. And we can see that there really aren't strong differences in the soil organic matter present in our 3 U of A sites. So Old Main, Atmospheric Sciences, and Gold Simpson are not really significantly different from one another. We also see that at Gunny Park, which is only 1 month old, there are no significant differences, but there tends to be a much higher presence of soil organic matter than the other sites. And then our residence, which is going on 8 years, there's a nice strong difference between our passive and our control basin. So we do see effective treatment at that site, but it's not different from the others. And so this is really thinking about what those specific management practices are and what they can look like at those different scales becomes important. But also land history. So Gunny Park was, it's a recent construction. There was also a team that went out and applied biological soil amendment to the entire park area. And it was a recent conversion from grass turf. So that whole area was recently dug up and changed from grass turf. So there's some remnant turf and in biomass organic matter present. We, going into this next indicator, we have this soil carbon stabilization rates and the decomposition rates for these different sites. Again, we have the sites on the bottom here. And we're looking at some of the differences between our passive and control. And so there's not a temporal component here as there isn't here, but we'll get into some of the temporal component in the next indicators. But we do see that there's higher stabilization. So the carbon that's present in the soils in our control system isn't really changing form much. So it's stable. Whereas when we look into those passive basins, they are transforming into usable sources of carbon, so becoming available. And we're seeing that there's higher decomposition rates that correspond with that as well. So that turnover of the carbon becoming available can be important for supporting other forms of life, plants, soil invertebrates, and such. For the one thing that I would like you to take away from this one, so this is our extracellular polymeric substances on the y-axis, and again we have these sites, but we're looking at it in May and in August. So May was really dry, and 2023 was a really not a great year for this study specifically, primarily because of the really late monsoon. So we all remember last summer, not this one that just passed, but the one prior, monsoons kicked in, I don't know, mid to late August. So we had added the soil, the tea bags, and we had collected soil samples late May prior to the monsoon season starting, making sure that we didn't have any rains before that, and then we got to the middle of the rains in August. So there's some stuff that's going on here with this late monsoon season, but the one thing I would like you to take away from this is we don't really see a lot of production of the EPS when it's really dry. But then once we add water, except for at the resident in the passive, when water is regularly available or more regularly available, we do see that all of this starts to change, and that really what's being impacted is our control. So does that correspond to more of a heat impact, or are we thinking that this is water? So that's a fun thing to tease apart when we do these kind of summer related experiments when there isn't very much rain. And so because we are interested in the carbon, this is your carbon extracellular enzyme activity, and they were lower in the monsoon season. And so this can be due to some of the inputs of the rain that's there, because we did go when rains hit, but there really weren't much, but things were wet, and a lot of these areas are getting runoff from roadsides or rooftops. So are they carrying water that has some potential for metals and that can lead to this inhibition for carbon activity? Or do other sources of carbon become more available that they're not as heavily having to invest in enzymes because it's kind of more abundant? And so a large part of this was also looking at a lot of chemical indicators, and there weren't a lot of huge differences. So we didn't see an impact of treatment for any of these chemical indicators. Site, there were some differences for total nitrogen, for total carbon, organic carbon, and inorganic carbon. And then the total sulfur was interesting because it did change seasonally, but it wasn't different across these sites, and it could be due to wet deposition. And so some of the takeaways for this work is that the site was mostly influenced by physical and chemical indicators, whereas seasonality, the biological indicators were impacted more heavily by site and season. So, and I can show this depiction slightly differently, but what does this all mean? Some of these things are really highly correlated. So the biological and chemical indicators tend to be positively correlated. And so can we start to think about them as being more interactive in that way, and to narrow down the total number that we look at in the future? And so when we think about the questions that were being asked at these different scales, for the impacts of seasonality, biological indicators might be more important soil metrics to measure. Actually, for all of them, for season, treatment, and site, to see if there are differences. But at the site level, chemistry becomes equally as important. And there's, physical indicators are still present and still relevant, but they're not as readily changed during management as the biological and the chemistry. And so some big takeaways and conclusions. So on the short time scale, green infrastructure can harness seasonal water inputs and drive important biological and chemical processes that likely improve. So some of these changes that we did see can be indicative of positive changes in the soil to support um, more nutrient availability or recycling of nutrients. But the site histories and practices are also incredibly important to take into account. So we're still looking at too many indicators. And so part of this work was, okay, next steps are really, first part was to kind of really dive in, and that's not something that I shared, but yeah. But how does this all fit into it, right? So we are applying all these nature-based solutions, and we're hoping that they're having an impact on the ecosystem function, and we are seeing some positive changes, at least when it comes to the soil health. And she gives a big thank you to a lot of people. Should have maybe changed the slide, but there's a lot of students that were involved. There's Sunnyside High School, there's the Storm to Shade team, Laura Meredith, Rachel Gallery, Joey Blankenship, Sam Rapp, some of the others that are here. And I will stop there and open for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation, Vanessa. And while you all are thinking of the questions you'd like to ask, or as you write those into the chat, I want to take just a moment to brag on Vanessa's behalf. I don't think she knows I'm going to say this, but in addition to these final presentations that we ask funding recipients to give, it's also a requirement to submit a report, an end of the year report on the project. And through that report, we saw that Vanessa was awarded from the University of Arizona the Maria Teresa Valles Outstanding Staff Mentor Award. And you can tell by being able to speak to the student's presentation. So as she mentioned, the student Phoenix Spivey, who worked on this project, but was clearly mentored by Vanessa and Laura Meredith and others. But clearly great mentorship to be able to jump in and share that information. So thank you. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or pop a question into the chat.
I have a question. I got stuck in another meeting and did not, it just popped on right now. Are we going to get a recording sent to us on email?
Yes, thanks for asking. Oh, Jesse, what about email? We definitely post the recording on the WRRC website, and there's a link to that website up above.
We'll send it to anybody who registered for the Zoom. So.
Okay, thank you, John. Yeah, any other questions? One new question. Oh, yep, there. Jesse just posted the link as well. Well, I have a question. It's not directly related to this, but in the introduction, it says that you founder of the University of Arizona Campus Living Lab in Green Stormwater Infrastructure. Could you tell us just a bit about that? And is it like open to tours, or yeah, how can we find out more?
Yeah, so as you walk around campus, you may not recognize that there's probably between, I don't know, roughly 70 or so, maybe more, green stormwater infrastructure features that help capture water locally. And it's been a big push by some great leaders on campus, like Grant McCormick, who's in planning, and ENDS as well, to create these sites. And a lot of them are generated by students. So the students go out and they build these locations. Well, one of the things that we wanted to do, it was funded by the Provost Investment Fund, was to acknowledge these locations. And so at Old Main, Gold Simpson, and Atmospheric Sciences, there's interpretive signage that's present now. There's also information for this work on the website, and we hope to engage more students to do projects here so we can learn more about the functioning of these systems, the performance of them, and there's data that's being collected every day out there. There's weather stations, there's soil moisture probes and temperature probes that are buried in the ground within and outside of basins. And so, yeah, the idea is that we hope to really engage everybody who is working in this realm, whether it be policy, artists, environmental scientists, that look at soil or plants or animals or whatever. These create habitats and green spaces that have health impacts. So landscape architects are also involved. But yeah, it's an important feature on campus that often goes unnoticed. And so we wanted to shed light on it and to share more. There is a website. I don't know if I can drop it in the chat to go visit and learn more. And yeah, we're always welcome, are open to give tours.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, and feel free to ask another question, but while you're thinking of any questions you have, I just want to highlight again that today's webinar was focused on the projects that were hopefully that's showing up, applied for in 2023, awarded in 2024, awarded and just finished up this year. And so we are now soliciting applications for the next round of, excuse me, I want to go back to the 104B. Yes, thank you. The 104B presentation, the 104B applications. Am I showing? Sorry, I'm trying to show the 104B. There we go. So applications will be due March 3rd. And these are for projects up to $5,000. Up to $10,000. And they must involve students, and they're eligible to anyone at the 3 Arizona State universities. And we will certainly update our website when we have more information from the RFP that gets released from the USGS when that comes out. But we never know quite when it comes out, but we want to try to get people enough time to start thinking about projects and get those applications submitted. Any final questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank again all of our presenters today and all of the attendees. Thanks for joining us, and we'll have this posted on the website and hopefully see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.